Okay, this video is why our alpha coverage has been a little bit late, because to actually do things right for Midnight, we basically had to look at everything. And one thing is clear, Midnight is not going to be the WoW that we're used to, and Blizzard are on an utter rampage. The overall goal is to make combat more approachable. But what does that mean? Well, it means reducing complexity. It means making gameplay more intuitive. And as a part of that, they're removing a whole ton of buttons. And I mean a ton. The Midnight Prune is real, and we've actually ran the numbers on what everyone started with and is going to be left with. So today you'll find out which specs have been hit the hardest, which ones still need a bit of a prune, and whether Blizzard are making the game feel better or a whole lot worse. It's quite huge, but not as insane as you may think, though some of you will definitely log in to find some rather empty-looking action bars, which is rather unlike how you'll feel after pruning your data from where it shouldn't be using Incogni, because they're both today's sponsor and your easiest way to fight back. You see, whenever data leaks, data brokers harvest it and then they sell it on. So if you've ever wondered how spam callers get your number, it's often stuff like that. And Incogni solves the problem by automating the legal work that you would otherwise have to do. And all you've got to do to get started is join at incogni.com/Bellular Warcraft. There, you'll get 60% off the annual plan, which is the plan that I use. And here's how it works. You enter your info, and then it works. It does its thing. That's it. It's that easy. You see, you have a legal right to get your data taken down, but doing that means manual paperwork, and it's not permanent. What Incogni does is automatically scan the brokers, it then sends the takedown requests and adds you to the suppression lists. It does all of this automatically, and they rescan to make sure your data is kept down. And you can see my own progress on my own dashboard. 217 sent, 2 in progress, 215 completed, and I'm on 26 suppression lists. That really is peace of mind, especially when there's quite a lot of hacks, quite a lot of breaches going on, even, for one example, the recent stuff with Discord. And at incogni.com/Bellular Warcraft, you get 60% off the annual plan, so check them out using my link today. Alright, how bad is it? Well, you're almost definitely losing some buttons. On average, specs are losing almost 3 things to press. To be specific, the actual average we calculated is 2.74. Now, look at the whole picture. Of all the specs that we tested, only 5 came out with more or the same number of buttons. The other 34, well, they are losing at least 1 button, and in the most brutal cases, up to 6 buttons. You may be wondering who got hit hardest then. Well, it's Holy Paladin, Holy Priest, and Enhancement Shaman. Then, on the other end, both Death Knight DPS specs actually gain a button, as does Fury Warrior. But here's the thing. The most common amount of buttons removed is a much more reasonable 2 buttons. Of course, knowing how much you lose is one thing, but we've also got total numbers to compare, where right now the average spec in World of Warcraft has 26.92 buttons to press. In Midnight, that drops to a nice round 24. The smallest amount right now is 22 buttons, and the highest amount is a rather insane 37. That, by the way, belongs to Resto Druid because of their cat form DPS, which isn't a surprise. Druids in general are a little bit bloated because of all their different forms. But they're not that much worse than others. Take a look here at Brewmaster Monk. They have 31 buttons, the highest of any tank in the game. Affliction and Demonology Warlock, they have got 29 each. That is a lot for just doing some DPS. In Midnight, all of these are coming down. As an example, Resto drops to 34, which is still super high. They're definitely an outlier. But Brewmaster, it comes down to 26. Warlocks drop to 25 and 26 respectively, but it's not just the higher end of things getting pruned. Take, as an example, Fire Mage and Havoc Demon Hunter. They were actually tied for the least number of buttons at 22. But in Midnight, they're actually down to 19 and 18 buttons respectively. So yes, the pruning is absolutely happening, and it's impacting almost everybody. But that's not the full picture, because I've not actually explained what I even mean by button yet. Because it turns out this story goes way beyond those numbers. My big fear would be losing my core gameplay, and that's where there is some good news. Of course, not every button is a button that you press all of the time. Plus, we're coming into a new expansion, which also means 10 new talent points. And here's why those things matter. You are probably losing more damage buttons than you are utility. So let me explain what all of this data actually is and how we even got the numbers that I've been talking about today. What we did is we built a custom add-on that scrapes Blizzard's spellbook. Yeah, we went that deep for this video. Kind of cracked, but it was pretty fun. Now, obviously, you don't have every spell at once because of your talents. So for every spec, what we did is we grabbed the most popular Mythic Plus build from Archon.gg. You may be wondering, why Mythic Plus? Well, just because it uses more buttons than raid builds in general, and that's because of utility and AoE. And that means that it's a very good comparison. It kind of hits everything that a spec will do. After doing that, we pulled everything into a spreadsheet and categorized everything into damage, healing, personal, and utility, plus a final non-combat category to mop up things like raid buffs. After doing that, we then created as similar as possible builds on Alpha, and then we did the exact same process across every single spec. And that is how I can tell you this, the important thing. We are losing more actual damage buttons than we are utility buttons. Across the game, we're dropping 1.92 buttons from our rotations, but just under 1 button on average from our utility. So with that in mind, who got hit the worst? Well, the answer by the numbers is Frost Mage, Holy Priest, and Holy Paladin. All of them are losing 5 abilities from their core rotations. But there's a problem with me saying that, because healers have got to both heal and do damage. That naturally means they have a bloated number of buttons and therefore more to prune. So, to get an even more clear picture, we've split the data down by role, and we found out that DPS are the least impacted in their rotations. But with that said, it is still quite uneven, by which I mean some specs are being grossly simplified. Take, for an example, the Fire Mage. The only word here that fits is gutted. It had 9 rotation buttons, which was tied for the minimum with Beast Mastery Hunter and Ret Paladin. Now, it is down to 6, maybe 7 if Meteor gets buffed enough. Phoenix Flames, deleted entirely. Shifting Power, gone. Scorch's execute function, well, that has been rolled into Fireball. And what that means is that even if they still have the same gameplay with Fire Blast resets and Pyroclasm, their bars do look embarrassingly empty. Now, for a different story, we can then look at Arms Warrior. It has been carefully pruned. They had the most core buttons at 15. Now they've got a much leaner 12, which still puts them in the top bracket. Here's the thing with that. They're actually not losing much gameplay. Avatar and Thunderous Roar won't really be missed. They were just fire and forget cooldowns, and Blizzard are trying to take some damage out of the cooldowns and put it back into, your regular ability so you don't feel useless outside of popping your coolies. Now, Thunderclap is one that's missing, but that's actually kind of fine because Rend is now AoE by itself. And they're getting lots of other changes as well, but those have nothing really to do with the pruning. Though it's fair to say some will miss the fantasy of becoming a big avatar man. The result, though, is a far more lean and sensible Arms Warrior. But that's not all we found, because some specs will look almost identical. Windwalker, as an example, loses 1 defensive in the form of Diffuse Magic, and Storm, Earth, and Fire is being replaced by Weapons of Order. So their gameplay is largely unchanged. Most specs, though, fall somewhere around the middle. As an example, Marksmanship Hunter only loses Explosive Shot from its rotation. Beast Mastery loses Call of the Wild, and Bloodshed is getting rolled into Bestial Wrath. Sub-Rogues lose their Flagellation because Blizzard decided ultimately playing WoW is Flagellation enough, and Cold Blood is no longer inactive, it's now going to be a passive. So what you see here is overall a Blizzard that's being quite careful when it comes to pruning rotations. They've essentially solved problems without causing that much harm, which certainly is good, and in our upcoming class change videos, you will see that designers have solved way more problems than they have created. Now, the next topic today will be healers, because they really have had the biggest changes, but there's 1 or 2 things to talk about first, because I've got 2 very important examples. First, Assassination Rogue. It's an example of a spec that's been surgically simplified, where they actually didn't lose any buttons overall. But Shiv is changing category. Right now, Shiv opens a bonus damage window for your Envenoms, but in Midnight, it just goes back to being the utility poison button. And that basically makes their cooldown windows less punishing, and it just lightens the rotation a little bit. Now, our other example is a bit weirder. It's Frost Mage with its massive rework, where in total, it's got 5 fewer damage buttons than in Midnight. As an example, Icy Veins is gone entirely. Ice Nova now replaces Cone of Cold, you can't have both, and thanks to changes made to Shatter, Frost Nova doesn't give bonus damage anymore, it's purely just crowd control. Shifting Power is also gone for them, like it is for all the mages, but Ray of Frost has now came in as their major cooldown, their mandatory one, the one that kind of defines more the look and feel of their spec. But that's not the crazy part. Here's the crazy part. Glacial Spike and Comet Storm are staying, but not as their own buttons. Instead, Frostbolt and Blizzard will change into those buttons under certain conditions, which basically means you get to use those cool spells, but without having loads of button bloat that will make your keybinding harder. I just think those are great examples of this stuff being done right, and I'd say that all in all, for us DPS players, Blizzard's actually done a great job with the pruning thus far. I mean, where specs could have lost buttons that they would have wanted to keep, we instead are seeing those abilities get consolidated, like what we just covered with Frost Mage, but also with Paladin. As an example, Hammer of Wrath now replaces Judgment during Avenging Wrath. That's one less button and no real loss. Now, we will do deep dives into every spec in the upcoming winners and losers video, because for now, I have something far more important to talk about, and that is maybe the real winners of pruning, maybe not. Healers. Right, healers have got the most buttons. It's been that way for a long ass time. They've got damage and healing in their rotations, and in our numbers, they're averaging 19 things to press. When you add utility, that goes up to 29. Now in Midnight, they're losing 4 buttons on average, 3 of them being healing or damage. So let's take a look then at the best example, which I think is the Holy Priest, which was an utter nightmare. Because to heal and do damage, you needed 19 buttons. They had so many different things. Now, it's just 14. Power Word, Shield, Renew, Heal, and the Oracle skill are all gone. Shadow Word Pain is gone as well. Those, of course, were completely extra buttons that weren't the core of what you were doing as Holy, so they were just sort of in there feeling miserable, but technically still part of your kit. But you're not really losing here because all of their effects are basically now baked-in passives. That will just make it easier to pick the right button for the right situation. You know, signal-to-noise ratio in your kit. Kind of an important thing. Now, another one that's been kind of saved is the Holy Paladins. And man, I know you guys have been suffering for a while. What we've seen with them is mostly pruning from damage, overlap, and niche spells. So, Crusader Strike, gone. No more Crusades for you. Hammer of Wrath and Consecration are now just both part of Judgment. Holy Prism is now a choice against Divine Toll. Blessing of Seasons has been sent back to the Shadowlands from whence it came. What we see though is that with power shifting back into your baseline healing, you can essentially do better with fewer buttons. I mean, so many of the old healer abilities were just noise. Now, it's just a lot easier to know what spells actually matter. And that's true for everybody, except for one, the Resto Shaman. Where, whoops, bit of a problem here. They're losing tons of gameplay. Cloudburst, gone. Healing Tide, gone. Healing Surge, gone. It's kind of wild, and initially Unleash Life was also gone, but Blizzard have actually given that back to you guys following some alpha feedback. And they did that basically so you'd have more to do than just spamming Chain Heal and Healing Wave. It's a bit weird. It is the one healer that's basically lost the sauce that's made it fun. That does blow, and I think Blizzard need to take a more serious look at Resto Shaman. Tanks, then, are a bit less interesting to talk about, but it is good news, where pruning has of course led to fewer buttons, especially with Brewmaster. And the simple TLDR of it all is that nothing's really been lost. On average, tanks are losing about 2 buttons, but most of those losses are getting moved into passive effects or are being replaced with reworks. Up to now, we've been talking about the core gameplay, and that is where most of the changes happened. And most of that change is positive. And I mean it when I say it that this is impressive. It's hard to make this amount of change on such a big game so quickly, but they've mostly managed to scalpel out the bloat, but take very little of the meat with it. The same should mostly go for utility, but I do have to say mostly because there are some victims. On utility, we first got to remember that it's a new expansion, we're getting more levels, and that means we get 10 extra talent points. 3 of those will go into your class tree, and at level 90, that means you'll basically be able to pick all the utility that you want. And that means that most specs should actually have more options in Midnight. But the pruning mostly counteracts that. I say mostly because many specs can now pick up things that they couldn't before. As an example, Death Knights with Wraithwalk, Warriors with Intimidating Shout, because those were abilities that were hard to fit in before. But there's also a lot of utility kind of disappearing forever, where only Elemental Shamans get Thunderstorm now. And they've all lost Stone Bulwark. Hunters are losing Bursting Shot and Implosive Trap. Monks only have a passive version of Diffuse Magic, and every healer except Shaman, well, They're losing their interrupts, which has been extremely controversial, to say the least. Covering the other roles, though, in some cases Blizzard have tried to save abilities via consolidation. As an example, Havoc has now got their Netherwalk immunity as a part of Blur. Ret Paladins have got Shield of Vengeance included in Divine Protection, and Warlocks can still heal their pets, but Drain Life does that instead of Health Funnel. So, pretty smart consolidation, the kind of thing that just tends to work. But there is one class that's been completely demolished, and if you main this class, sit down and get ready. If you're a mage, you may feel kind of ruined. Mass Barrier is gone. Tons of your crowd control are now choice nodes. That reduces your options. Shimmer is at its cooldown, increased massively. Blink's second charge is now your class tree capstone. Now, displacement is still there, but it's a choice against that capstone, so you can't have both, and it works as a Blink double tap instead of its own button. Honestly, for them, it's brutal, and they've probably went too far. But by now in the video, you've got a fair idea of what's going on, so let's bring this into the big question, which is, but is any of this any good? Did Blizzard make the game feel better, or did they make the game feel worse? Well, based on our time on the alpha, they have mostly made the game better. This has been a positive change. Even removing a few abilities has made most DPS substantially easier to keybind and to understand. That'll probably be good for a lot of players, and these changes have actually been backed up by changes made in the dungeons, where cast times are longer, there's a better signal-to-noise ratio. This is clearly Blizzard designing a new era of World of Warcraft that's not going to be rooted in add-ons and that sort of thing. Now, healers should benefit massively from less bloat, in theory. Overall then, designers have done a great job here. Classes are still fun to play, and importantly, they're fun to get good at. But there's a small caveat, and it's that I hope they don't go any further here. Take, say, Frost Mage, it's the most recently reworked one. What they've done with Frostbolt and Glacial Spike is elegant. I think for most players it'll be fun, but for some, it may be a bit frustrating. And another thing lost is part of the fun of having a new ability, the physical sensation of hitting a different button. When your bars look empty and you're pressing the same 3 to 4 buttons over and over again, then the rest of the game does need to be more exciting to make up for that. And of course, it's Blizzard's dungeon, raid, and encounter design that will be the proof of that. Anyway, this was a fun way to look into button counts, but there's another count that's kind of important. It's the subscriber count of World of Warcraft. We may have just found out what it is. It turns out, per something that Blizzard officially put out themselves, that WoW might be bigger than even the pre-Cataclysm peak. But I know one thing for sure, it doesn't feel like that, and in this video, we'll explain why.